So over to you, Ashley. You've got some slides as well?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'll just ask you to talk loudly and don't move too much because of the online people can see you. Thanks. I know it's weird to
This way?
maybe just don't worry so much about
This
that.
way.
Just
Okay.
I think the voice is more important than the video.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So hello everyone. My name's Ashley. I'm a recent graduate from QUT, which is the Queensland University of Technology. I also want to introduce my peers who couldn't be here with me today, but they developed this project alongside me. Jasmine Priddle, Unrun Zhao, and Yaowen Yu. We developed this paper as part of our final placement at QUT as social work and human services students, working alongside the wonderful Jenny Mays to develop our 5-step framework that uses photo voice to develop counter-hegemonic insights for activism in breaking down structural barriers that are exacerbated in crises and ultimately shape the UBI policy agenda. Our paper is titled Universal Basic Income in Times of Crisis, Shaping the UBI Policy Agenda with Photo Voice and Social Media. For today's presentation, in the interest of time, I will only briefly cover our literature review, focusing mainly on our framework and findings. The COVID-19 pandemic had an undeniable impact. Unemployment skyrocketed, financial security plummeted, and poverty increased as inequalities were exacerbated. Our project is really defined by the fact that in times of crisis, income security, standards of living, and participation in society are threatened. Groups already vulnerable to structural inequalities and oppression are disproportionately affected. And a UBI has shown to be essential in responding to such inequality, financial stress, and uncertainty. While acknowledging the implementation of a basic income has differed amongst pilot programs, we worked with the agreed characteristics that it is an unconditional, non-stigmatizing, direct and modest payment provided on a regular basis to all adult citizens and permanent residents of a country or globally. We also considered the current Australian welfare system. With the imperative for a UBI, social media has the power to shape public perception and the political agenda in Australia. It not only expands the reach of policy actors to contribute to discourse, but has potential to shape narratives surrounding social problems and generally increase public support. There is also an identified need for anti-poverty advocates to use emotionally compelling narratives to show the benefits of a UBI, particularly in counteracting the negative justifications against it. And this is where photo voice research methodology lends itself well to responding to the aims of our paper. When planning our research design, we used photo voice and autoethnographic principles to develop a framework that analysed the experiences of our own research team during the pandemic. Photo voice as a research method was developed by Caroline Wang and Mary Ann Burris and involves participants making meaning of their own experiences by collecting images and photos. In our case, we chose to be both the participants and the researchers in the process. To begin the photo voice analysis, each person brings an image that is significant to them. Through piloting, individual and group reflection, we developed this 5-step framework that facilitates the process of analysis to draw out key themes and narratives. Step 1 is the individual analysis, where each person searches their image for meanings, metaphors, ideas, and symbology. Here, a short narrative is prepared to describe the image and its personal meaning. Step 2 is group conversation and initial collective analysis. In the space, each person explains their chosen image, including any meanings identified and reasoning for choosing the image. In a group discussion and analysis, patterns, themes, and frames of meaning attached to the broader social conditions and context are initially extracted. In the third step, individual reflection is undertaken on meanings identified from images being shown together for the first time. Spaces of resistance and insights with dialogue are highlighted. In step 4, further group discussions are held. Here, a common narrative is built. This really links back to the idea of creating emotionally compelling narratives as part of advocacy efforts. At this stage, we linked images and narratives to the imperative for a UBI. And the final step is a higher order analysis. Key themes are drawn out and matched with critical social theory, and any gaps are identified. The goal is to promote critical dialogue about social issues through the discussions about photographs and uncover true experiences and narratives about the experience of crisis that necessitate a basic income and disrupt the mainstream hegemonic discourses that exist against it. Importantly, the steps are not a strictly linear process, and multiple group analyses may occur before consensus is built. In the findings, we present the images collected amongst our team and the results of the analysis. We drew out 5 key themes from our experiences: unemployment and underemployment, rising inflation and cost of living, poverty and adequate standards of living, gaps in the welfare system, and the financial impacts of crises. I begin with Anren's image. She brought this image of the construction industry as a contextual example. It is an image from a news article published in February 2020, and it shows workers impacted by the collapse of building company ProBuild, citing COVID-19 restrictions and lockdowns causing costly project delays. Over 750 employees and thousands of contractors were impacted. The COVID-19 pandemic and ensuing lockdowns and restrictions, including hard border closures, caused costly delays to projects and procurement activity, leaving many in the industry without work. The way workers are employed in the construction industry in Australia can be precarious under normal circumstances. While not the case for all construction workers, many are often independent and subcontractors, relying on project work for their income. With their projects ceasing, so too did their income. The positive effects attributed to a UBI reflect some of the very principles of social security, providing at least a basic level of income security for all, a support which would have made all the difference for all these workers left in this uncertain situation. The next image is from Jasmine. It is a snippet from the front page of the newspaper, the Courier Mail, and one of the headlines is Rates Pain: Highest inflation in 21 years to tighten cost of living squeeze of families. It is an explicit representation of the increasing inflation rates that have defined much of 2022 in Australia, and hence the rising cost of living, which has significantly impacted the everyday life of Australian families. The most significant of these impacts are the rising interest rates, growing pressures within the rental and property market, and the rising cost of groceries, petrol, gas, and other utilities. Although this image explicitly shows the rising inflation rates, it is also a clear call for the implementation of a universal basic income system. The rise in inflation rates, coupled with job insecurity experienced both prior and post-pandemic, have further exacerbated existing financial insecurity felt by many Australians. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has created a surge in financial concern about the future for Australians, and have therefore created an opportunity to place the idea of a basic income system back on the policy agenda. Whiteford and other influential commentators have indicated that a basic income program would prevent falling into poverty during times of crisis, as it is, by definition, basic, unconditional, and universal. The prospect of basic income seems like an appropriate answer to the precarity of financial insecurity during The prospect of a basic income seems like an appropriate answer to the precarity of financial security during times of crisis, such as the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, as it provides an income floor for those facing poverty. Yarwin sourced this image from the Brisbane Times. It shows people sleeping rough under a bridge in Brisbane. The image itself was taken in 2016, but the issue is as current as ever. Experiences of poverty were particularly worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic, with many people losing their jobs and having reduced work hours, causing increased financial pressures. People already doing it tough were hit even harder by the financial insecurity that came with the pandemic. This image depicts an explicit call for action for better financial support systems. Part of why we chose photo voice as our research method is because it uncovers narratives that are left out of dominant discourses and gives a voice to the voiceless, so to speak. Making these injustices visible highlights the necessity and urgency for a basic income to support those already vulnerable, reduce experiences of inequality and poverty, and provide the means for an adequate standard of living. I felt a collage was best to represent my experience of the pandemic. It depicts multiple scenes and a motif shared globally. The world was on hold. The COVID-19 pandemic, and the year 2020 in particular, saw an inundation on the news and from the state and national leaders here in Australia announcing shutdowns to stop the spread of the virus. Non-essential shops were shut, planes were grounded, streets were empty. The world was on hold, and that meant so too was my own personal search for employment. Unfortunately for me, I entered the pandemic unemployed, so I had not lost my job due to the pandemic. There was no going out to look for a job. I was not underskilled, but I was still unemployed, falling into a strange limbo of being ineligible for COVID-19 support payments. The need to purchase basic essentials did not go away. The cost of living did not stop rising. Yet I found myself falling through the gaps of the welfare system, and my experience was not unique. There are multiple gaps in the welfare system, including the crisis support payments that were introduced during the pandemic. There are so many reasons people are unemployed or need income support, but if they don't fit into the eligibility requirements, then they fall through the gaps, and this is why we need a basic income. As an egalitarian, non-discriminatory provision, a UBI is what is needed to fill these gaps, maybe before a crisis even occurs. And this final image was one that we agreed upon as a group. It is an image from the ABC News website from March 2020, showing a long line of people queuing to enter a Centrelink building. The scene pictured may be familiar to some, either through viewing the news or from personal experience. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the government introduced support payments. However, in the early stages of the pandemic, the MyGov website crashed, where people were supposed to be able to access Centrelink online. This was supposed to be facilitating the application process, but due to the failure, thousands of people were forced to line up for hours outside Centrelink offices across the country to apply for the benefits in person. The image is an explicit representation of the current system failing. The desperation demonstrated by all these people is a point no one should ever have to reach in a society that claims to be equal and just, yet is anything but. Not to mention the increased risk of contracting coronavirus itself these people had to face just to receive a payment aimed at maintaining the standard of living. And this affected many, many people, not just those already on income support. The pandemic affected everyone. While there were still limitations to access and eligibility criteria, in a broader sense, this demonstrates that the government was willing to implement support payments for everyday Australians, as well as businesses. So it shows that with the right political commitment and government, we can implement a basic income. Overall, across these images, a story of precarity has been told in different contexts. This process showed that the structural conditions of inequality and insecurity had wide-reaching impacts, and the pandemic left no room for hiding failures in the system. The inequities were made visible. Hence, each of these images and narratives highlight that there is a need and potential for universal basic income to be implemented, as well as the value of using these images in social media to raise awareness and engage in activism. The key theme of precarity amongst our experiences points to a broader trend of increasing precarity, job insecurity, and rising costs of living, which was clearly shown to be exacerbated during times of crisis. It is clear that a universal basic income is essential in addressing this, and thus the imperative exists for the implementation. To do this, we are suggesting as part of implementation that social media and the counter-hegemonic tools it offers, as well as activism, play a role in the transition towards a universal basic income. We know from pilot programs that a UBI is actually affordable. And with this now clear imperative and narrative, photo voice can be used with social media to make a greater impact and reach the masses. We come back to that point of how anti-poverty advocacy requires emotionally compelling narratives. Not only that, it provides a means to reshape dominant narratives that is essential to any change process. It is undeniable that a UBI is essential in offering security, dignity, and a decent standard of living during times of crisis. And by using photo voice to uncover narratives that necessitate such a provision and social media to reach audiences, a UBI can be pushed onto policy agendas as a way of redressing poverty during crisis and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley, for a beautifully timed presentation and a great set of ideas, I think, in terms of reminding us about the power of an image in terms of campaigns, particularly around policy, and that frames matter as much as facts in changing the hearts and minds of politicians. So really interesting set of ideas there. And we might now have some questions, comments from people in the room, then I'll go to people online if we've got any of those as well. Austin.
There was two sort of goals, it seems, for these campaigns, and one is reaching politicians and the other one is reaching the masses, as you put it. I would just put it to you that perhaps the masses are already on side. We saw polling from that Tim Hollow at the Green Institute did, and we had 58% of people supporting an unconditional payment. So I think Noam Chomsky has a line. He goes, "You don't campaign by getting people to do what you believe or to change what they believe. You campaign by getting them to act on what they already believe." So I don't think that's at odds with anything you're saying. I just wanted to add it.
I have a question or a comment just around the use of images, I suppose, when campaigning. And I wonder, I don't know if this can be answered or not, but how can you use images in like a non-paternalistic way when you're creating campaign, when you're trying to pull at the heartstrings of politicians or groups of people? Like, it can be quite degrading for various subgroups to be portrayed in that way. And I just wonder if that's, was considered, or if you have any answers to that.
It certainly wasn't something that was considered. Off the top of my head, I think that when we were developing the project, we really wanted to, the whole reason that we chose to be the participants in the photo voice was so that it was something that, so that it was a personal story, that we were sharing our own story, we weren't telling someone else's story, I guess. That's a really good point.
Yeah, particularly around dominant images used to portray poverty, for example, and getting away from charitable response, I think really important in terms of selection of images. Joe?
Thank you, great paper. I saw a paper last week that talked about the ways in which different social media platforms disseminate and reproduce stories depending upon ownership structures and all that sort of stuff. So I just wondered if you'd given any thought to, okay, once you've got those narratives together and you're at the point where you're engaging with activists to try and get these stories out, you might also consider that, we know, for example, Twitter disseminates stories depending upon the political perspective in different ways, and so too does YouTube, and so does Facebook and so on. So it's just, I just want to throw that in there if you're looking for that stuff. Go to the School of Social and Political Sciences sort of page at Sydney Uni, just because it's all up there. It's sort of a recent project. So yeah, thank you, really interesting.
Do you have any comment on?
Yeah,
okay.
There was some of that in our research. We didn't go too much into specific platforms, but yeah, that's a really good point, because I guess the danger of some platforms is that the points against a UBI, I guess, are much more, I don't know what I'm trying to say, some platforms it's certainly harder to tell facts from opinions.
Yeah.
So yeah, it really isn't. It's important to, I guess, target to specific platforms.
And just the overall finding from this recent study was that right-wing content is disseminated through several nodes, and therefore is picked up and reproduced at a much quicker rate. And left-wing content seems to go through central nodes, but then is left off this kind of reproduction system. So, interesting, particularly if you're advocating for a UBI, which, I mean, we know that the basic income cuts across the political spectrum, but yeah, just something to consider.
Thanks, Joe. Anyone else got a comment on this theme about platforms, social media in general, confirmation bias, and partly what Joe's point was, and algorithms and the way in which they work once you start to search certain amount of comment, start to reinforce each other, confirmation bias, in trying to break that down. We'd like to think the internet is a democratizing force, that it isn't always. No? You let off the hook, Ashley. Thank you very much, Ashley, for the paper.
Thank you.
We don't have any questions online, but just encourage people online, if they do, to put them in the chat function rather than some other function.
Q&A function.
Q&A. Thanks, Troy. Troy and I are the kind of blissfully ignorant. We didn't go to most of our technology training as part of the preparation for the conference. We contributed in other ways, didn't we, Troy? But that's good that you remembered that piece of information somehow. So I'd like to move now to our next paper with Kai. Is Kai in the room? I was trying to do a little walk around before to see whether Kai was here. Is that what you've got on your program? That's what I got on mine.
Yeah.
So Kai might show up, in which case, Austin, sorry to put you on the spot, but we might move to you. So I'd like to welcome Austin Mackell to discuss global social liberalism, a progressive ideology for the 21st century, and Austin's part of the Fair Go Australian Basic Income Discussion Group.
Oh wow, I see now the webcam, you're either sort of in the light here,
exactly,
or you're silhouetted.
Yeah.
So,
but I think, as I said, main thing is your.
oh, that's not so bad if I'm here.
Slides, eh?
Yeah, that's me.
Just get you up there. You can drive
And
yeah, we can see you well then, Austin. That's fine.
I normally do this in I'll just open it up in Chrome because I know how to put it in presentation mode
Okay.
there.
Yeah, we've got time. Possibly a lot of time.
Oh,
I doesn't show. I might just go and check with the Rego desk while you're setting up.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon, everyone. There we go. Now I'm going to swing wildly in the opposite direction. We've just had something that's very much about the current crisis, or the recent crisis, and sort of tactics that we can use to deal with it. I'm zooming right out and talking about the big picture and what we should be thinking about over the next, 30 to 50 years. This is a generational project rather than something that we're going to be completing in the next electoral cycle or anything like that. I'd also suggest, if people have questions along the way, I'd actually kind of prefer to answer them as they come up, because I'm going to sort of race through a lot of ideas very quickly rather than go in depth. If that's all right with you, Greg, I'm just saying.
You don't need to race either. So Kai has registered but hasn't shown up so far. So
okay. Well, in any case, if people have questions as we go, I'm happy to answer them as we go. So global social liberalism, I'm presenting this as a progressive ideology for the 21st century. So points for grandiosity, I know, but I hope you'll bear with me. So what is global social liberalism? Perhaps the best way to answer that is to break it down into parts and start with what is social liberalism, and leave the global out for just a minute. Now, one thing it's not is what we can start with, and it's not social democracy, which is probably the sort of background ideology, I'm assuming, of most people at the conference, right? And most people who are coming to basic income are not actually libertarians who just want to cut social services. They're people who are coming from who are grappling with the problems of social democracy in many ways, and some of its failures. So this is a response to that. Now, we can say that social democracy is essentially a negotiated class struggle. The workplace is the main battlefield, and unionists are the negotiators. And so that has made social democracy very sticky, because the union movement has produced what I sometimes call the union academic industrial complex, which has a role in shaping politics and gives us And as basic income advocates, I'm sure we've all sort of come up against that at some times, as well as working alongside it. Now, social liberalism instead focuses on universal economic rights. So it's overtly focused on formal political measures, and it aims to fix the workplace by changing conditions around it, rather than necessarily getting into that, that scrap between the bosses and the workers. The other thing an ideology has to do, the key thing an ideology does in some senses, is answer the question, who am I? So, what social democracy says is you're a worker, or if you're not, you're some kind of parasite, more or less, right? It's a very, I'm not utilitarian, there's another word I'm looking for, it's a very, it's utility based. It's what are you giving and what are you getting? It's very much about who gets what and whether you've earned your dinner for the night, right? Whereas social liberalism says you're a citizen. It's got this civic sense to it, this constitutionalist sense to it. So I've created like a little Venn diagram here of the political spectrum. On the left-hand side, we've got collectivist. In the middle, we've got a sort of egalitarian perspective. And on the right, we've got an individualist perspective. And you can see there are these areas of overlap. Obviously, this is wildly simplifying things, but come with me for a second. So pure collectivist without much concern for egalitarianism, it would be communism. Everyone's got to make sacrifices for the collective good and, roll up their sleeves and sacrifice for Mother Russia or wherever. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got neoliberalism. It's purely an individualist and there's no real concern for egalitarian or collectivist issues. We're just, Jeff Bezos made however many billions of dollars, good for him. Someone's starving in Dakar, for example, that's too bad, right? So social democracy sits here between the collectivist and egalitarian circles. Social liberalism instead is over between the egalitarian and individualist perspectives. So this brings us to a question that is not often asked on the left, which is, what does social democracy get wrong? First of all, it's not global. It's very much contained to the nation state. And one of the things when we're talking about national basic income plans is that we run the risk of compounding a lot of those issues, because if you have a basic income in Australia that's $2,000 a month and one that's $20 a month somewhere else, then you're still going to have this massive imbalance in labor power and wage demands and so on. It has a bad narrative of class struggle. And you see that within the basic income movement. You've got people like Guy Standing, who obviously I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what he says. But the precariat can kind of when he talks about the precariat, he's talking about a lot of the same issues. But what he's trying to do is recreate a class identity for everyone to rally around, right? That's the banner. We'll rally around. We're all the precariat and we all want a basic income or whatever it is. And so you've also got Yanis Varoufakis. He talks about techno-feudalism, and the new techno-feudalists are the new aristocrats. There's interesting to ask, though, who is he and who are the other academics in this? If we're moving into this neo-feudalist perspective, well, then the academics become kind of like the clergy, and they become kind of, that's their role is, in some sense, the clergy were in opposition to the landed gentry, but they also did a lot of ritual, a lot of guilt, and in some sense, they end up demobilizing people through this excessive focus on guilt, and they're not as radical as they seem sometimes as a result. And I think it's a bad vision, which is the fully employed nation state. I mean, if that's your goal, it's just not that progressive. It's not that forward looking. It's something from the past. It's not the future. Here's the really hard question, though. This is the one that nobody on the left wants to talk about, which is, what does neoliberalism get right? And I would say they say consumption is good. They're not trying to guilt people into having a lower standard of living. There's this great contradiction in left-wing politics is we want to raise income, but we're anti-consumerist. So which is it? What's the difference between a higher living standard and consumerism as the boogeyman? Maybe we want to worry about the environment, sure, and maybe there are reasons to stop consumption because of the negative consequences. But in and of itself, it's not something we should oppose. It's in fact the goal of progressive politics and a basic income especially. There's also something called the entrepreneurial self. Now, there's the neoliberal version of this, which you could sort of kind of think of as the, your personal brand, and everybody's got to have a market themselves to the employer and so on. But what I'm thinking of is what Loriana Lucioni talks about. And if anyone's not familiar with her work, I recommend checking it out. She's out of University of Queensland as well, isn't she? She's fantastic. I'm a big fan of hers. And she talks about, like going off the grid and growing your own vegetables, in a sense, is the entrepreneurial self. And it's a version of the self that is not defined as a worker, and it's defined as independent from industrial production, sort of homesteading. That's a version of it. I want to be an artist, I want to be in a band, whatever it is, right? And this is really the key thing that I think neoliberalism gets right. And what's the thing that we've got to steal is what I call superficial diversity. Now, everyone, like the example, and this is something that people criticize about it. I think Roger Walters has got a song, we've got McDonald's in the Andes and Pepsi in the Himalayas, and it's so terrible that everything's the same everywhere you go. Thomas Friedman says the world is flat, and that's a good thing. I think the world is not flat. It's highly slanted and uneven, but if it was flat, that would be a good thing. We actually only want diversity at the superficial level. We want people to be able to get married in a mosque or in a forest grove or at a church. We don't want anyone to marry a child, right? We only want diversity when the stakes are pretty low, actually. We don't want diversity in the quality of medical care. We don't want too much diversity in the quality of housing, right? We actually want a sort of deep homogeneity. And what I would suggest is that neoliberalism just gets that wrong, what the content of that homogeneity is. So people should be able to move to any country and expect similar environmental and labor standards, right? So what neoliberalism has done is it's pushed for what I call downwards harmonization. Everyone's familiar with this. It's the race to the bottom, right? Everyone's cutting their wages and cutting their labor standards, so we have to do that to compete. What we want instead is upwards harmonization. And a global basic income, which I'll come to at the end, is the fundamental tool for doing that. By implementing a global basic income, not instead of, but as well as national programs, you lessen the intensity of cross-border wage competition. Someone is going to be less desperate to work in a garment factory in Bangladesh or down a mine in South Africa if they have the option of a decent life outside of that employment. And that will not only benefit them, but it'll also benefit the workers in the West that they're competing with. This is what I mean by changing the workplace by changing the conditions around it. So another way we can look at it is who are examples of social liberal, and Roosevelt is the classic example. Now he's often attacked from the left of not being a real leftist, and that's right. He wasn't. He wasn't a Marxist. He was much more of a capitalist. But he proposed something called an economic bill of rights, which Bernie Sanders has revived and talked about in recent years, and his goal was to add economic rights to the sort of shopping list of liberal rights that Americans already had, right? And then, as a global social liberal, we have Eleanor Roosevelt, who was lead author on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which again does have economic content. I would say some of the content of that is wrong. It talks about the right to a job and the right to an income, if I'm remembering right. But I would suggest that we really just focus on the right to an income and a decent standard of living, because that's much more achievable. And jobs aren't so great, really. Right? Mostly we wouldn't go if we didn't have to. And I think there's a kind of millennial renaissance of these values. I'm talking about these values not as something that I think doesn't exist. I think that there is already, if you go to a backpackers hostel anywhere in the world, and you're there and there's someone from Spain and there's someone from China and there's someone from wherever, there's a sort of background rules of the conversation. And nobody's going to argue that poverty is good, and nobody's going to argue that authoritarianism is good. So you've already got this sort of basic consensus, I would say, amongst millennials who are cosmopolitan millennials, right? And Rutger Bregman has articulated that with his books, Utopia for Realists and Humankind. And the essence of that is that this is the millennial renaissance, as I was talking about. It's earnest, it's hopeful, and it's not afraid to be accused of kind of naive humanism. All of you are already global social liberals, because basic income is a socially liberal policy. It addresses individuals, not social classes. And this is a global conference, so checkmate. You're all already You're already signed up, I'm afraid to tell you. But seriously, so what, right? That's the most important question you can ask of any person making their stump speech is, well, who cares? Why do we give a shit? Pardon me. Well, I'm just pitching the name, really. That's all I'm really bringing to the table, is that we have this 3-word label, global social liberal, right? And that allows us to recognize ourselves and understand where we're coming from better, and recognize each other when we meet each other out there in the world, as I'm sure you'll start to notice that you are meeting global social liberals. And if we agree that these are the values we share, just to name them, they're individualism, egalitarianism, and globalism. These are the 3 values that I'm saying. You've got to tick these boxes and say, I believe in these 3 things, then you welcome aboard. If we agree on these, then we can develop a broader utopian agenda which can conceivably succeed neoliberalism in a way that social democracy can't. Social democracy was before neoliberalism, and it's stuck at the level of the nation state. If you look at what happens to social democrats, where do they stumble? At the borders. Brexit, boats, Trump and NAFTA, right? Hillary Clinton's biggest problem and the Democrats' biggest problem is NAFTA and the trade deals that they've come up. Yeah.
Can we say that they're a problem because of individualism?
Yeah.
What's a problem because of individualism?
Borders, Trump, all of the things that you just talked about.
Well, but wouldn't collectivism force us more into our national identities and force us more to otherize?
Well, you can have like a translocal struggle, so it doesn't mean to be within a nation state. I think that individualism is potentially problematic.
Sure. I mean, this is where it comes very much down to core values, right? And I guess this is where what I'm suggesting is to the right of social democracy. I'm saying that individualism and consumerism, so Zizek has this thing about how we should reclaim the grand march, this aesthetic of the big collective from fascists and from the totalitarian group. And I think if we're gonna try and salvage that, then surely we can salvage the idea of the flowering individual, right? And what we're trying to do is salvage it from the marketing industry, really, and say that no, there's something deeper. I personally I believe in individualism. I believe that conformity is a big problem, and
But I don't think conformity is the opposite to individualism. Collectivism is not mutually exclusive to conformity. And don't you think that there's room for collectivism?
yeah, sure. So a slide I had here, but I took out, is Elizabeth Warren and her trade proposal, which she made during there's definitely room for both. And what I would suggest is you can be a social democrat at the national level and then still have these global social liberal ambitions. So her trade proposal was the idea that that if China or whoever wants access to the US market, they should be forced to meet similar standards, right? So that's where social democracy is proposing a similar goal in terms of this upwards harmonization to social liberalism. I don't think they should be at each other's throats. I think there's space for both, as you say. But anyhow, talking about developing this broader utopian agenda to succeed neoliberalism, just jump back and let's look at why now, right? Is the other question. So we've had social democracy as the dominant ideology between World War II and the 70s. Sometime between the 70s and the 80s, that shifted into neoliberalism, which we had till 2008. Then I would suggest we've had what you could call zombie neoliberalism. It's already dead, but it doesn't know it in the intervening years. And you've seen some of the core tenets of neoliberalism, like budget austerity, start to get eroded. The rules are breaking down of the old system. Then we had the pandemic emergency, and now it's time for whatever comes next. There's the attempted return to normal, which is about to go completely off the rails. You can hear the global system straining, sort of squealing under the pressure of this attempt to return to how we were before the pandemic, which was already in many ways, a rolling crisis. So whatever comes next, we'll be drawing on the previous ideological periods, as well as whatever comes forward. So this is what I'm talking about, where we get what neoliberalism gets right, and then this idea of individualism and globalism and so on. But what's most likely to happen, I think, unfortunately, at least in the short term, is Trumpist economic nationalism, which is what social democracy is in danger of degenerating into if it isn't prepared to evolve and change. What's most desirable is the global social liberalist ideals that I've been pointing out. It's a cliche to say it, but it's a good one. Pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will. So we have to be prepared for the likely outcome that we have a sort of a right-wing populist. I don't like using that term because they generally don't win the elections in terms of the popular vote. But you have this sort of right-wing nationalist, economic nationalism, because we're not ready to make the jump to an egalitarian global system, because it's going to be really, really difficult to do. But what would that look like? Long-term, and here I'm talking mid-century goals. One is a world parliament, and that would then be a sort of a voice of the people at the global level, and it would oversee the reforms of the global institutions, including global financial institutions, and those global financial institutions would then pay a global basic income. So I knew there was something about basic income in here. I swear, it wasn't false advertising. I was going to get there. And I would suggest that this would be issued in a new global currency, which could replace the US dollar as the global reserve. And that would in turn be tied to SDRs, special drawing rights that the IMF issues. So an SDR is transferable for US dollars or transferable for a basket of other major currencies. And one of the ways it's transferable is that governments can pay off their debts to the IMF using these. So what I'm suggesting is you'd have this new currency, which was paid directly to the citizens of the world, but then governments could either collect that in taxes or exchange it in a currency exchange, and then use that to buy SDRs in auctions or some other system like that. So you'd create a sort of a global version of what Jeff and Michael have been talking about in their various presentations of a global sovereign currency being issued. To get there, now this is obviously a huge goal, and as I say, it's something that would have to be considered over generations, and I have no idea who the agent of this change would be. But this is where we can start to think about that. One is an alliance of democracies. So you take something like NATO and you expand it to include other democracies. There are people to talk this way. And one thing I think it could begin is what I call a trade desirability index. So rather than having this sort of hodgepodge of unilateral trade deals or the old World Trade Organization system, you have the OECD get together and say, well, you get points for having democracy, you get points for having good environmental protections, you get points for having high wages and good labor conditions, and the higher your points are, the more access you have to the markets of the developed world. And then that's a sort of it's what we're doing now with Russia is a sort of ad hoc version of that, saying, "Oh, you're bad, so we'll cut you out." Whereas if we set this up as a sort of a background set of rules, you can imagine having over time pushing people towards more democratic systems, right? Reform of the United Nations. These are all as well as, not instead of. And that just means that you actually use the mechanisms detailed in the United Nations procedures to change the charter of the UN, create the World Parliament, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, this is my favorite one, it's the Global Tribunate. Now, I take this idea from George Monbiot. So George Monbiot wrote his book, 2003, The Age of Consent. He doesn't talk about it anymore because it didn't sell very well. But I read it and I loved it. And what he did was that was a book that changed my whole perspective, because it combined world federalist ideas with the campaign for economic justice, for global economic justice. And I don't agree with a lot of it, but one of the things he says is, the tribunes of the plebs, there's this story, doesn't matter if it's true, the story is that, the plebs of Rome were angry one day with the senatorial class not paying attention, so they gathered on a hill outside of Rome and they said, we're electing our tribune, and if you don't listen to him, well, there's going to be hell to pay. So the idea is that the people of the world just set it up. So George Monbiot said you take the Sao Paulo, the World Social Forum, and you develop that into a standing body which has the right to speak on behalf of the world's population and has some kind of electoral legitimacy. and then the electoral legitimacy of that body and the existing institutional heft of the United Nations are sort of drawn to each other by gravity, is the idea. And this is the one where we get to, smash bank windows and set cop cars on fire as well, if they don't listen. So that's my personal favorite of the three options, although it may not be necessarily the most smooth and effective. But I think what you do is obviously all three of these strategies have to be pursued in tandem, and they kind of, you trap the global system as it currently exists in a kind of pincer movement. So that's my presentation. I forgot to put a thank you page on, so just thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Austin, for that provocation from ideas to end to institutions. I'm sure you'll get a reaction from people in the room. They've already got a hand up here in the front and then at the back. You first.
I have two questions. So the first is it's an interesting choice of words, social liberalism, or you could reverse it and go liberal socialism, But they're both dirty words, right?
That's, well, all the better, right? Why have just some people hating you when you can have more? No. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say liberal socialism would work, because liberal socialism, I would think, essentially starts with a class analysis and then adds some liberal stuff on top. What we're saying is, no, let's focus on people as individuals and on individual human rights, which include economic rights, and that's where that language comes from.
Right. Well, good luck with that one. The second point is the Venn diagram appears to be missing a circle in the middle, in my opinion.
What's the circle in the middle?
Yeah, go home and name the circle in the circle in the middle.
The very middle there.
The very middle. There should be
one there that touches all three.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and we could put, socialism here, and we could put green neoliberalism down here, and we could put more on there. I'm trying to keep it, top level. It's deliberately simplistic.
Yeah, but what's the word? What's the word for the thing in the middle?
Egalitarian.
No, that overlaps social democracy and social liberalism.
Well, I mean, egalitarian politics, I guess, and this is what I was going to do when I had that slide about Elizabeth Warren, was I was going to get rid of these ones and say everyone inside the egalitarian circle should be working together, more or less, despite our differences. So that's kind of, I would suggest that social democracy and social liberalism are both strands of sort of moderate egalitarian politics.
Yeah, because it's interesting because you brought up towards the end, the whole world government obviously being elected democratically. That's very on the democracy side of things, rather than potentially the liberalism.
Yeah, but when social democrats are often more concerned with outcomes and the sort of constitutional process, whereas John Locke liberalism is very much about, what the rules of the voting are going to be and whether it gets the Jimmy Carter tick of approval.
Sure.
And this is unambiguously constitutionalist and civic and legalistic, I guess, in that regard. Jeff?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, there's a lot of... Oh, sorry.
No, you're right. I'm just collecting the question.
It's a very great presentation, Austin, but especially to say the university context. But I mean, on the one hand, you want individualism, on the other hand, you want globalism, and you seem to exclude all sorts of intermediate groupings. So you exclude class groups because, and I tend to agree with you on that, because the class concept is always setting up a bogeyman, something we've got to be against in order to establish what we're for. But on the other hand, your idea, the globalist view, produces a hegemony, doesn't it? That where is the subsidiarity that allows diversity and also gives you some protection against the global concept going wrong?
Well, look, the World Federalists in general I would revert to the standard World Federalist response to that, which is that having a global or a global government doesn't necessarily reduce the power of national governments. In fact, if you're anybody but America, China, or Russia, having a global legal system is actually going to increase the power of your national government, because you'll be less dependent on superpower backing, and you'll have to worry less about what America thinks, and you'll have an independent umpire to go to. It won't just be a matter of, might makes right. in the sense, and so this is, I'm not saying we abolish the nation state or anything here. This is about changing the context in which nation states relate to each other, and it would actually favour the national sovereignty of all but the most powerful states by putting that into a legalistic framework. I would add that, let's say my opinions are wildly unpopular, and we actually want a smaller UN, and we want less global governance, we want more national independence. Well, that could actually be reflected in the elections of a world parliament, much like the nationalists have a large voice in the European Parliament. So if you think that the UN is interfering too much, and that there shouldn't be any World Trade Organization, and the IMF should dissolve and not be replaced, then you could still express that at the level of the World Parliament. I would just hope that the fundamental thing that I would want to come out of that is a guarantee of a decent economic standard for every human being.
I've got a couple of questions online, but I want to go to Sam, Joe, and then so you had a question too.
Yeah.
So Sam.
Thanks, Austin. I really enjoyed that. That was very convincing, and you clearly considered a lot of these criticisms ahead of time. I've just got two questions. One is, how do you reconcile the fact that individualism is ahistorical? Like, we are very successful as a species because we are collaborative, we work together, that whole Dr. Bregman collectivist anarchism argument. And two, how do you reconcile the fact that relates to identity? Like, class war is fun because we can relate to this group and position and other, and the question of identity is something that's really massive, I think, and it's really difficult to overcome when you're making this argument. So those are my two questions, I guess. Individualism is ahistorical, and also that compounds into, like, collectivism is part of identity.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would suggest that what we're talking about is looking to the future for our identity more than looking to the past, which is what progressive politics used to be about, and saying I identify with the people not yet born who are going to be benefiting from this, and I identify as a futurist and as a globalist against the sort of petty nationalism. I mean, it's a real challenge, but it's also those other national identities, being a Kiwi or being a Botswanan from these minor powers. They would actually say, well, I want to protect that national identity from the imposition of American culture and Chinese industry and so on. So that a global institutional framework can protect those collective identities.
Yeah. I guess I'm going back even further than the nation state, or, like, when I say ahistorical, I mean in terms of our evolutionary biology, we're just hardwired for collectivism. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, you're not trying to eliminate that. You're just trying to make the competition peaceful and
right.
So there'll still be national groups and ideological groups and religious groups, and they'll all compete but on Twitter and in the World Parliament rather than with tanks and guns.
Yeah. It's the Federation of Planets.
Yeah, exactly. It's Star Trek.
Yeah.
It's all about how we get. This is halfway to Star Trek is the World Parliament and a global basic income. Cool.
Can I just comment to you, because it made me think of something. The way I perceive individualism in this context is that it empowers you to associate freely with whatever you want. It could be that I want to belong to this group, I want to associate with this religion or this belief, but it doesn't make it punitive for you to not associate with whatever collective that you happen to be born in, or place that you happen to be.
I don't want to skip the queue, but I have a comment on this same thought and a suggestion. Individualism, it's kind of a dirty word, as can be thought of that way. When I kind of think about those things, for me, it's always about agency. It's about the agency of individuals to do what they think is best for their life. So maybe use something around agency rather than just going straight to individualism.
Sure.
I think that's what you're actually talking about.
Yeah, you're right. And I think as well, this might be a bit of a response. I'm sorry, I can't read your name tag, Lucy. When we talk about individualism as well, in the West, it's more of a dirty word. Well, it's a dirty word for a different. It's a dirty word for a different reason in the developed world that it is. It's a dirty word everywhere, but in the underdeveloped world, individualism is still taboo, and it hasn't really ever been around. You must conform, or you'll be punished violently, right?
So you link it to consumption.
What? Okay, yes. But what's happened in the West, perhaps, is that we've gone too far and we've gone into this, atomistic society where everyone's disconnected from everybody else. But if you take a global perspective, perhaps we can converge on a more balanced approach. This is again about that harmonization of the life worlds between the developing and developed world, right? An agency, yes. I'm going to take in.
We might come back to that debate. We'll go to Joe first, and then I want to go to Sarah, and then I want to take a question online, and then we'll come to you. Joe?
Thanks. Thanks for lots of food for thought there. Just a question. It seems to me that there's an assumption that there is going to be some kind of popular support behind this. And I just wonder, you quoted Gramsci, Zizek, and Chomsky. So it just made me think about the idea in Chomsky's famous work, the manufacturing of consent. Of course, Gramsci's talking about coercion and consent, and then Zizek talking about the way in which ideology is kind of lived. We live these compulsions even if the veil is lifted, right? Even if you expose exploitation and so forth, we still need to go to work, we just still need to eat, rent a house and that sort of stuff. So I just wonder, we can't simply will this into existence, right? So what about the material obstacles in the way, particularly about how that consent is manufactured to support the very thing that is exploiting?
Well, I think there's a couple of tacks I'd take here. First of all, I don't know. This is a question which I think about a lot, and until now has defeated me. But optimism of the will, right? This is very much a should. This is what I think should happen, not what I think will happen. But I would also suggest that one of the ways it might be that there's two things that would make it more likely than it might seem. One is that I think the current system is going to collapse and people are going to be looking around for alternatives, including people with decision-making power. And secondly, this transfers well outside of basic income. I think there's a lot of changes that need to happen in the media. We've got the internet, I think, but I don't think we've yet built the sort of culture and the tools to use that in a constructive way. We're talking about social media previously. Look, this in my day job, quote unquote, as much as that's a thing, I work in trying to change media, and I think that that's a whole other question. And that if we can work on transforming the media, then we can open up the realm of the possible. Because one of the things that has to happen for change to come is consensus doesn't have to just exist. People have to know that it exists. So most people support a basic income, but if you ask them, they don't think it's a popular idea. And that's the case with a lot of things, is that everybody agrees, but they don't know that everybody else agrees because they don't see it reflected in the media and they don't see it reflected in politics. So there have to be changes in the way the media and politics are conducted. And I'd love to take that up with you over a beer if you're up for it.
Thanks, Joe. Sarah?
Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, with the idea of a world parliament, who would keep the world parliament accountable? Because you have corruption within national parliaments, even within the UN itself, and I feel like what would really be the difference in terms of accountability to the systems that we have now to that?
Well, again, that goes back to media questions, I think, because the fourth estate are what we depend on to keep politicians in check, and there's a whole set of different crises there that have to be addressed in the media and through changes to media practice, which would make all of this. I mean, we can't even solve that problem at the national level at the moment. So we kind of have to solve that regardless. There'd also be the national governments themselves, which would obviously have significant power and clout in this. And you've got the various organs. So you'd have the UN that exists now. You have the World Parliament and a development of international courts and so forth. And you have a similar kind of separation of powers that you have at the national level.
We might come back to that in a moment. It's Michael, isn't it? But just before we come to you, do you mind if I just read one of the online questions so that we include our online community? So it's a question actually from Loriana, who you cited.
Hey, Loriana.
That Liam's put up. The question is, how generalizable is the millennial Renaissance example that you mentioned? How do you suggest moving from reactionary to revolutionary in transition and infuse in utopian thinking amidst spreading nihilism, disillusionment, and disempowering psychological and economic conditions? So can you tackle all that in about 2 seconds? Yeah, good.
Answer that one.
Look, I actually question how widespread nihilism and disillusion are. I think it's often, again, well, to quote Zizek again, which I probably shouldn't do if I'm saying I'm, this liberal, individualist, but he talked about one idea he has that I think is really interesting is the virtual belief. And that's a belief that nobody holds, but we all still act like we all hold it, right? And I think that this idea that, everybody's a nihilist, no one believes, everyone's saying that because they are all feeling like, heartbroken idealists, and they're all feeling isolated, even though they're all, and even as we're saying it to each other, we still can't seem to build that feeling of connection because we have this perceived public that we're arguing with who is really a product of a dysfunctional media system. There was also the millennial renaissance. I mean, look, my wife is here. We met in Cairo in 2011 during the Arab Spring, and the same spirit that was there I saw in 2009 in Tehran, right? And you see it in the sort of part of the pink tide movements in Latin America, and also the people arguing against the pink tide socialists in Latin America. They make their arguments on this same basis. And I mean, that's all entirely anecdotal, but we no one's doing the polling on a global scale. But although there is some polling globally about, for example, democracy, right? And global polling about democracy shows that people believe in the ideals of democracy, but that they feel the current institutions aren't capable of doing that. And I would suggest that one of the reasons the current institutions are failing is that race to the bottom, where there's this downwards harmonization, where an individual government cannot raise labor standards, cannot raise environmental standards without putting themselves at a disadvantage in a competitive global economy.
Thanks.
I don't know. I hope that helps, Loriana. Thank you, Loriana, for all your great work, by the way.
Michael, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you, Michael.
One of the things that, just to comment on this whole mindset, is I can't remember the name of the university, but there was some university in the US who changed the alcoholism that was taking place by getting everybody to understand that what they personally believed was actually what everybody else believed, rather than what they thought everybody else believed about drinking as a culture. And suddenly when everybody agreed that, we don't like drinking as a culture, it completely changed. So I do think it's possible, but how you get that at a global level, that's another question. My other observation was, right at the very end, you brought in basic income, and potentially that could be the defining trigger that helps to coalesce all of these other things, because right now we're getting cryptocurrencies that are supposed to be universal basic incomes, but are really crap. We're going to get, in my view, central bank digital currencies, and that when that happens, being able to lock them into SDRs and so on to provide a little payment to everybody in the world linked to the internet technology that will enable them to get it on their phone. Certainly by the middle of the century, that ought to be achievable.
Well, you say, if we're talking about a global state, right? In fact, a global welfare state is the way I describe it sometimes, right? The state has a currency, the state has a legislature. To me, as a politics and philosophy grad, it sort of makes sense that first you have the parliament and then you have the currency. But maybe it won't happen that way. Maybe it'll happen the other way, as you're suggesting. But both of those things, the state and the currency which enters the global economy as a basic income rather than through, financial markets and central banks and stuff, or via maybe central banks, but then to individuals rather than, through lending.
And I think Michael's other point was about, basic income being that kind of ingredient that thickens democracy and gives people the mental bandwidth to think about deliberation.
Absolutely.
And tackle the kind of issues that you're talking about here. So
it's a bit of a chicken and the egg. How do you get the change without getting the change? All right.
Yes.
I had a question to ask him. Thank you. Very great presentation.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
I'd like to learn more from you. Bangladesh, I'll ask in relation to our country. You said economy that is dependent on garment export and remittance sent by the migrant workers. But the problem is the economy, the GDP is growing 7%, 8%. The land share is eaten up by less than 5% people, and all the workers are living at the subsistence level. So there is a problem of widening inequality. Huge inequality is great. So you suggested about global basic income approach. I think that can work. But if we do not work with the global supply chain, and as well, I discussed with Sandy also, if we do not work at the national level, the structural issue, the systemic issue, then if the system remain, rich, then how the global basic income will help? If you send money to country like Bangladesh, if the system do not,
Okay, so
how it will help?
So in Bangladesh, you have a classic Marxist situation where you have workers who are being exploited because they have nothing to sell but their labor, right? And they're doing so under conditions of extreme desperation, which means that they don't have much bargaining power. If they have this basic income, that increases their bargaining power relative to the people who own the factories. And if you just did that in one country, then the people who own the factories would go, oh, well, we'll move to Sri Lanka or we'll move to wherever people are still poor. But if that's why you have to do it everywhere all at once, then all the workers of the world, get more power. This is what I'm saying before. You change the workplace by changing conditions around it. The worker is coming to the job interview, so to speak, with a full stomach. They're not coming in hungry, right? And that gives them more power to demand wages. And my bet would be that at the national level and at the global level, if you have a basic income, the wage share of income also increases relative to the profit share. So workers have the permanent strike fund, as people have called a basic income, and and that would also mean that that would even flow on to workers in the first world, but it would be most strongly felt in places like Bangladesh, rural China, places where there's extreme poverty and people are like, well, I have to take any job for any wages because it's better than nothing.
I think too, though, you were making the point that the systems of distribution inside somewhere like Bangladesh, how do you actually get the money to you and and it's not siphoned off and whatever, and that potentially down the track through the internet that might be possible, but it's not now. Yeah,
well, I mean, the way I actually wrote an article about this at the beginning of the pandemic called "Remittances from Nowhere." So when you mention that it's remittances, it's like as if every country was getting remittances from the moon, right? But one of the things I argue the way I describe it, that is that the UN creates a digital wallet for each human being. So you're going to need a national identity card of some kind. And then once that enters the UN system, you have, a list of people in the world who could also be the voting roll for the World Parliament.
Joe? So just to add to this, because I think this question is really important in terms of bringing in the economic dimension to what has mostly been kind of philosophical discussion so far. And it just makes me think about where we are right now in Australia, right? So we take the Australian labour market, for example. We are we've hit a historical low in terms of the functional distribution of income. The wages to profit share has never been lower since.
That's good. I thought you were going to say we've hit record low unemployment and we have a labour shortage. So I'm so glad you didn't say that. You go.
Since ABS started collecting this data in 1949, 1 in 4 people of the 12.5 million people in the Australian labour market has a bachelor's degree, 80% employed in services. My point here is that it's almost the opposite of Bangladesh, where the workers would seem to have a relative amount of education and therefore also affluence and so on, but the wages share of income is historically low. Now,
that's because we're competing with people in Bangladesh. We're competing with people in Bangladesh in manufacturing. We're competing, if you're an engineer, a software engineer, you're competing with people in Bangladesh and India.
But I suppose we can't even get a basic income trial off the ground in Australia. So what makes us think we can just wish one into existence globally?
Hey man, as I say, this is very much a should, not a will happen thing. But I also think that, sometimes bigger goals and loftier goals actually mobilize people better, right? There's this idea that progressive politics has been sort of subscribing to for a long time, that if we just keep shaving down our expectations and making less utopian claims, and if we just ask for less, then surely we'll get it. And it hasn't worked, has it? Right?
Yeah. Make the big claims, but we also have to be front.
Yeah.
I want to make a comment. I think a factor that we forget to think about when we introduce UBI into the world is that people will have time. something that they don't have right now.
Yeah.
People's time will increase exponentially. People's demand on outside provision of services that they need now because they don't have the time, like take out, cheap garments, whatever, childcare, all these things will reduce. There will be a spike. There will be confusion.
But that's after we get there, not how we get there.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
There's a time in the middle where it's going to be confusing and everything will be sort of clashing with each other. But I think people will have time, and when they realize that they have time, they'll prioritize different things.
I think that the way we get there is with national universal basic income. I think, you talk about capitalism as a race to the bottom. I really think of a universal basic income as like a race to the top. I feel like a lot of countries, particularly you take South Korea as an excellent example, they might be the one that gets there first. The rest of the world is going to have to compete with South Korea once they get a universal basic income. That's how I see it.
But South Korea is also going to have to compete with the rest of the world, and its manufacturing industry, for example, will be going to workers.
Just to finish on this thought.
Sorry, yeah.
But I think, think of it from the perspective of housing first, right? You get the homeless off the street, and you pay less as a government. You get more productivity from people. It's just like the pie grows and everybody wins. With a basic income, that if it happens in South Korea first, for example, the rest of the world is going to have to compete with South Korea's innovation and all of the things that is going to balloon out of that country. And I think then basic income, like Scott Sandhans was saying, that domino effect starts to fall. And when people have more time, like Australia is one of the most individually charitable countries in the world. And I think we want to see a basic income globally. And so you'll see, I think once a basic income happens, I think that's your way up.
Absolutely. I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that at all. If we had a national basic income in Australia, if we had one in Europe, if we had these, a continent-wide basic income in Europe, seems like it could happen conceivably. Those things would make this both more likely to happen and more necessary, because that international inequality would grow. But from the point of view of the ruling class in Bangladesh, they don't want to introduce, they're going to see South Korea taking off. They're going to say, well, this South Korea and on all the developed countries follow South Korea's example. We all get a basic income. People in the ruling class in Bangladesh say, great, we now have even more of a competitive advantage by having cheap, desperate labor. Let's double down on that. Our strategy of poverty for the masses equals profit for us just became even more beneficial. So yes, that there would at these depends how your country's competing. If your country is competing in who can be the cheapest, then having a basic income doesn't help you. If your country's competing in who can be the most innovative, then yes, it does. But I think we kind of have to take that option off the table for the more predatory national elites.
Well, maybe, but I think if you mobilize all the people in South Korea and stuff who then have a basic income, they're going to be screw you, elites in other countries, and maybe we'll come together more globally.
I hope so. I don't disagree.
Emma, but if that's the case, it would have happened with democracy, which it hasn't.
But if you look at
because why would the countries that don't have democracy are incredibly jealous of the countries that do.
Sure.
But they still can't achieve it that way because there is an obstacle.
So we have achieved, the Give Directly has achieved a lot. In terms of essentially the most successful basic income. And that's a case of just essentially generosity of the people proving how effective, and that's money coming from elsewhere in the world going to a place that's
and if our economies as we rush off towards the Star Trek future, you hear this stuff about we could have much higher GDP growth, we could be much wealthier, our capacity to give to these places would increase. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, and I don't know which happens first. I'm just saying that this is what I want to happen, and as I'm saying, this is 30-year minimum sort of time frame I'm thinking about. So I'm hoping that we get a national basic income well before then. Yeah.
So we're going to wrap it up soon because I can see people making afternoon tea, and he's been on his feet a long time. But Sam, did you want another quick one?
Quick comment, Austin. I think given the amount of discussion, it means you're probably onto something. That's all I wanted to say. I think you're probably onto something given how much we have to say about it.
And I think that there's not that much divergence between some of the
No.
points. So Emma's point around the sort of national and basic income schemes can make the case for global once we see the evidence, in the same way that we see experiments within a country can make a case for national governments. But we also know that experiments can block permanent basic income because they can be that kind of yes, no, in the way that pilots are often used in social policy. But also just in terms of utopian, I think you can use it in different ways. So not just as this is the blueprint for the future, but utopian demands are also a way to problemise the present, right? And Foucault wouldn't say to come out with the scheme and having to catch it. He would say you leave it up to moral adulthood to determine what they'll do at the time that's going to be released in the way that you've just said. So I think you can use that utopian demand in two ways, not necessarily to sketch it out what it's going to look like in concrete, but at least give people a sense of what it's going to look like that gets liberated. And it really is the new politics of time, I think, that is part of the selling point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is definitely like a stepping stone to the next thing, to whatever comes next. Once we've got a basic income and a world parliament, then we can start thinking as collectively as a species about what we want to do next. Until then, we're just kind of, wrestling in the mud for a knife.
We're going to Mars.
Well,
Yeah.
on the interstellar level, then we'll leave
Thank you very
Austin.
much,
Thank
Greg.
you very much, Austin. And for everyone's discussion. I think despite the fact that we didn't have one of our presenters, we certainly made up for that in a very lively discussion in the way that we did, and we broadened that out to a whole lots of issues perhaps we didn't thought we would necessarily start with. But I think, again, some of these will be revisited when we come to thinking about agency, thinking about the place of work, thinking about conception of precariat, and whether that's still useful. Guy will be speaking this afternoon. I don't think he's going to touch on that theme as much because he's going to be more talking about the Blue Commons and his new book in that regard. But if you have a question about precariat that you want to get to Guy and whether that is a class or not, which is a debate that Guy has engaged in the past, and I'm sure there might be time to ask that before we get to a drink. But Guy won't be here in person, so he won't be able to have that drink. All right, so I think afternoon tea's out in the same place. Then we're back at 3:30. You've got 10 more minutes than you might have had otherwise. So do what you will with that time, which we're just talking about. Temporal autonomy. Thank you.
Yeah.